Good morning, class, and welcome back to How to RPG. This is my 100 level series covering the RPG genre of video games for veterans and newcomers alike. If you're new here, please do be sure to get subscribed because I am SuperDerek. I make thoughtful and thought-provoking videos for gamers who love RPGs, and in this case, I'm also your role-playing game counselor. So, in the previous session, I gave a brief overview of the RPG genre as a whole and introduced several subjects at more of a surface level, and we glossed over several of the details, but in today's video, we're going to start diving a little deeper into the roots of the genre to help us build up a foundation for future discussions. So as we touched upon briefly in the overview, the RPG genre of video games began by attempting to simplify and codify pen and paper role-playing experiences to the point where even a computer could take on the task of the dungeon master. But what exactly does any of that mean in English? Well, to explain that, we need to know what a pen and paper RPG is, how it's played, and maybe even knowing a little bit about how they came onto being would be pretty helpful. So let's go ahead and do just that. Starting with Chainmail, which was a precursor to Dungeons & Dragons. It was created by Ernest Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin. The game was created initially purely rooted in reality to create a set of rules for engaging in one-on-one tactical combat using miniatures on a small-scale tabletop battlefield. Gygax further adapted these rules, though, and made a spin-off way to play Chainmail based on a medieval fantasy setting, which he tacked into the back of the rulebook as an alternate way of playing. This alternate way to play included adding things like monsters and magic and sorcery and all sorts of cool fantasy things, elves and characters like that, and it really took hold with a lot of the, well, nerdier aspect of his audience who were into the Tolkien sort of books and things of that nature. And this would go on to inspire Dave Arneson to create Blackmoor, where players would play the role of adventurers exploring Castle Blackmoor using the same sort of tactical combat established by Gary Gygax. You could think of Blackmoor as sort of a DIY fan mod of Chainmail, and it added role-playing elements to the tactical combat that Gygax established in Chainmail. This took Chainmail from being simply a tactical combat sim to quite possibly the very first pen and paper RPG. Now Dave brought this homebrew with him to Gen Con and showed it to Gary Gygax, and the two actually began working on a collaborative effort together which combined the elements of both and further codified and solidified the existence of what would become known as Dungeons & Dragons. So that was how the first pen and paper RPG came into existence, but what does a game of Dungeons & Dragons even look like? Well, it sort of changed a lot over the years, but most recently, people are playing 5th edition, and a game of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition at minimum consists of about 2 main people, at least 1 player and a dungeon master, but will often contain more players than that. The dungeon master might sound kind of on its surface like a way to refer to a boss of a dungeon or something, an antagonist to the player, and in some cases in media they're sort of portrayed that way, but that's often far from the case. If Dungeons & Dragons were a sport, then the Dungeon Master would really be more like a referee, an officiator. Though they often do more than this because they're also often the writer of the story being told, the creator of the world that the players explore, and the narrator that brings this whole world to life through nothing other than word of mouth and maybe some miniatures. Players of Dungeons & Dragons are playing the role of single characters for the most part, getting into the minds of these characters, making decisions of what to do and how to interact with other party members or other characters in the game who are in turn controlled by the Dungeon Master. Not just dungeons are controlled by the Dungeon Master, it's the entire universe. You could think of this as an interactive sort of improv where your actions are sort of restricted to certain rules, and then the outcomes of those attempts to do certain things are determined by dice rolls and character statistics, but above all else, the discretion of the Dungeon Master. The Dungeon Master is of course a storyteller, after all, and it sometimes requires faith in your Dungeon Master that maybe they'll bend the rules here or there in order to further serve the story. A really basic example of this is suppose you're playing a role of a dwarf barbarian and you want to find a room to stay in for the night. Now you could ask a passerby where to find the nearest inn, but it might be a human town, and they might not take too kindly to dwarves. So your dungeon master might ask you to roll a charisma check. So you roll a 20-sided die, and that gives you a number between 1 and 20, and to that you add a modifier. It's a flat bonus that's determined by your statistics that you can apply to rolls of a specific sort for any sort of skill or stat check. You roll a 14, which is pretty good, but you're a dwarf barbarian and you have pretty poor charisma as a stat, so your modifier is -1, making your roll actually a 13. Meanwhile, the Dungeon Master has already determined what the difficulty level of this check would be, and that rating could be any number depending on how standoffish they think the human is going to be that you are talking to. This time, let's say it's a 14, meaning you just missed it. Now the DM has a few choices. The DM could either tell you that the human almost wants to tell you, but then thinks better about it when they turn around and notice your diminutive stature and recoils a little bit. Then they motion vaguely off in that direction over there before bustling away quickly. A failure, or at least less than helpful information. Or the DM could decide that, you know what, it's been a bit of a long game, this isn't especially interesting, so how about I just bend the rules and say, you got it, and the person gave passable directions to the inn. Now the point of the rules is to provide a framework and flexibility to create a world in which your players can have fun, after all, and if it isn't fun, then it should be adapted. And that's how it's sort of like improv in a way. Now this set of actions is applied to any number of mundane or fantastical tasks as the DM finds could be fun or interesting, all the way over to combat with hordes of fictional monsters. Needless to say, the Dungeon Master plays an integral role to the experience of the player. But it should also be noted that a willing and eager participant as a player is equally important. Now, when run by a particularly skilled Dungeon Master, the experience is incredibly immersive and engaging, and it is unlike anything I've ever experienced before, especially when played alongside a bunch of friends that you are comfortable and familiar with. Dungeons & Dragons itself is really only one of several pen and paper RPGs available by this point, but it is currently enjoying a bit of a resurgence in popularity, and there's really been no better time to get involved in Dungeons & Dragons than today. Pen and paper RPGs, again, are essentially just a framework, building up the world, a set of rules that help define how to interact with that world. Now, some Dungeon Masters craft their own worlds from scratch and make their own quests, whereas others might run a campaign based on a pre-composed set of worlds and quests that were published by the game publisher, and these are known as modules. Now, the best way to really learn how to play D&D and what it is by doing, but the second best way to learn is actually by watching. So before we wrap things up for the day, please allow me to leave you with a small piece of homework, if you will. To get a better understanding of the tabletop RPG genre and what they are and how they play, spend a few minutes watching Matthew Mercer's one-shot, or one-session campaign with Stephen Colbert. If you don't have time to watch the full hour-long episode, you really don't have to, but this is a really basic D&D campaign setup that's easy to follow along with because it's just two people, a dungeon master and a player, and they're both extremely entertaining to watch and listen to. And with Stephen Colbert returning to Dungeons & Dragons after a 20-year hiatus, you get a lot of brief overview of a lot of how the rules work. It provides a lot of perfect context for a lot of the changes that we'll be covering in the adaptation of RPGs into early computer RPGs next time on How to RPG. But unfortunately, it is that time that we wrap things up, so again, if you're new here, please be sure to get subscribed because I am SuperDerek. I make thoughtful and thought-provoking videos for gamers who love RPGs or who could love RPGs, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day, everybody, and class dismissed. It is hot. Too hot to be wearing a suit.